The champagne flute sparkled under the crystal chandeliers. Laughter echoed through the grand ballroom of the Banton Manor as guests raised their glasses for the 7th toast of the evening. Nobody noticed the man in the burgundy suit slip behind the catering station. Nobody saw him pull the small vial from his jacket pocket. And nobody, not one of the 200 wedding guests, realized that 12 of them had just consumed their last drink. Within 20 minutes, the celebration would turn into a massacre. The first victim was Uncle Theodore, 73 years old, beloved patriarch of the Whitmore family. He collapsed face first into his wedding cake, convulsions racking his body as foam poured from his mouth. Then Aunt Constance started screaming, clutching her throat as blood streamed from her eyes. One by one, they dropped like dominoes across the marble dance floor. By 11:47 p.m., 12 wedding guests lay dying in pools of their own vomit. The bride's ivory dress was splattered crimson. The groom was on his knees, frantically performing CPR on his new mother-in-law. And standing in the corner, watching the chaos unfold with cold satisfaction, was the man they'd all forgotten. His name was Fletcher Garrison, and this wasn't random violence. This was revenge, 15 years in the making. But what could possibly drive a man to poison an entire wedding reception? What dark secret had the bride's family buried so deep that they were willing to destroy anyone who threatened to expose it? And how had Fletcher planned the perfect murder in plain sight of 200 witnesses? The answers will chill you to the bone. Before we dig into this twisted case, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the shocking true crime stories we uncover every week. This is the story of how one family's lies created a monster, how betrayal can fester like poison in a man's heart, and how a wedding celebration became the stage for one of the most calculated acts of revenge in modern history. Welcome to a case that proves sometimes the most dangerous person at the party is the one you've forgotten was even invited. June 15, 2019. The Banton Manor stood like a fairy tale castle against the Connecticut skyline, its limestone walls glowing golden in the summer sunset. This wasn't just any wedding venue. It was where New England's elite came to celebrate life's most precious moments. Tonight, it would become a crime scene. Isabella Whitmore had dreamed of this day since she was 7 years old. At 28, she was finally marrying her college sweetheart, Preston Hayes, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune. Everything had to be perfect. The flowers, white peonies and baby's breath, cost more than most people's cars. The 7-tier cake stood 6 feet tall, decorated with edible gold leaf. The string quartet had flown in from Vienna just for tonight. 200 guests filled the ballroom, their voices creating a symphony of celebration. Crystal glasses clinked, designer heels clicked against Italian marble. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and anticipation. The Whitmore family had spared no expense. Charles Whitmore, Isabella's father, owned half the real estate in Hartford County. His wife, Margaret, sat on the boards of 3 major charities. They were Connecticut royalty, untouchable, respected, and absolutely convinced of their own superiority. But money can't buy you safety from your past. Fletcher Garrison moved through the crowd like a ghost. At 41, he was still handsome in a weathered way, his dark hair now streaked with premature silver. His burgundy suit was expensive but not flashy. He looked like he belonged here, and that was exactly the point. Nobody questioned his presence. Nobody remembered sending him an invitation. If they had looked closer, they might have noticed the way his jaw clenched when Charles Whitmore laughed. They might have seen how his hands trembled slightly when Margaret kissed Isabella's cheek. They might have recognized the cold fury burning behind his pale blue eyes, but they didn't look closer. They never had. The reception was in full swing when Fletcher made his move. The band was playing The Way You Look Tonight as Preston spun Isabella across the dance floor. Her grandmother's diamonds caught the light as she laughed, throwing her head back with pure joy. For a moment, just one moment, Fletcher almost changed his mind. Then he saw Theodore Whitmore raise his glass in yet another toast, his booming voice carrying across the ballroom. To family, to loyalty, to keeping our secrets safe. The irony was perfect. Theodore had no idea he was toasting his own death. Fletcher slipped behind the catering station where servers were preparing the final round of champagne. The vintage Cristal, Charles Whitmore's favorite, sat in neat rows on silver trays. Each bottle cost $800. Each glass would be worth dying for. The servers were distracted, laughing at some private joke as they arranged canapes. Fletcher's hand moved with surgeon-like precision, extracting the small glass vial from his inner pocket. The liquid inside was clear as water, odorless as air. He'd perfected the formula over months of careful experimentation. 12 drops. One for each year they'd made him suffer. He selected the glasses carefully, not randomly, but with the methodical precision of a man who'd planned every detail. Uncle Theodore's glass, because he'd called Fletcher a liar to his face. Aunt Constance's, because she'd spread rumors that destroyed his reputation. Margaret's sister, Patricia, who'd turned the whole country club against him. Each drop was personal. Each victim had earned their place on Fletcher's list. As he worked, memories flooded back. Birthday parties where he'd been treated like family. Christmas mornings spent opening presents under the Whitmore tree. The day Charles had called him son and promised him a future in the family business. That was before Fletcher discovered what Charles Whitmore had done, before he learned the truth about the family that had raised him like their own, before they destroyed his life to protect their precious reputation. The servers returned, lifting the trays of doctored champagne. Fletcher stepped back into the crowd, his heart hammering against his ribs. In 20 minutes, it would all be over. In 20 minutes, the Whitmore family would finally pay for what they'd done. But what no one knew, not even Fletcher, was that his carefully planned revenge was about to spiral completely out of control. Fletcher Garrison's story began with tragedy and ended with it. Born to a single mother who cleaned houses for Hartford's wealthy elite, he grew up in the shadow of mansions he could never afford to live in. His mother, Elena, worked 16-hour days scrubbing floors and polishing silver. Also, Fletcher could attend decent schools and maybe, just maybe, climb out of poverty. She died when Fletcher was 12, a heart attack at 34, brought on by exhaustion and stress. The doctors said she'd been working herself to death for years. That's when the Whitmore family stepped in. Elena had cleaned their house every Tuesday for 8 years. She'd watched baby Isabella take her first steps across their marble foyer. She'd helped Margaret plan countless dinner parties and charity galas. When Elena collapsed in their kitchen on that cold February morning, Margaret held her hand as the paramedics tried desperately to restart her heart. At the funeral, Charles Whitmore made a promise. Standing beside Elena's modest casket, he placed his hand on Fletcher's shoulder and said the words that would change everything. "You're family now, son. We'll take care of you." And for 5 years they did. Fletcher moved into the Whitmore guest house, a converted carriage house that was bigger than the apartment he'd shared with his mother. He attended the same private school as Isabella, just 2 years older, and fiercely protective of the girl who'd become like a sister to him. He spent holidays at their table, summers at their lake house, and weekends helping Charles with his real estate empire. Charles taught him everything: how to read contracts, how to negotiate deals, how to spot investment opportunities. "You've got a good head for business," Charles would say, pride evident in his voice. "Someday this company will need fresh blood. Someday it might be yours." Fletcher believed him. More than that, he loved Charles like the father he'd never had. He loved Margaret's warmth, Isabella's laughter, even cranky Uncle Theodore's terrible jokes. For the first time in his life, Fletcher felt like he truly belonged somewhere. He should have known it was too good to last. The crack in his perfect world appeared during Fletcher's senior year of high school. He was 17, already accepted to Harvard Business School on Charles's recommendation, already dreaming of his future with the Whitmore empire. He was also falling in love with Isabella, though he'd never admitted it to anyone, not even himself. That's when he found the files. Fletcher was helping Charles organize his home office when he stumbled across a banker's box hidden behind a false wall. Inside were dozens of manila folders, each one marked with dates going back 25 years. Out of curiosity, the same curiosity that would later destroy his life, Fletcher opened one. What he found inside changed everything. The files contained evidence of systematic fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion spanning decades. Charles Whitmore, the pillar of the community, the man who'd raised Fletcher like a son, was nothing more than a criminal with expensive suits and charity board positions. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Fletcher found in the folder marked Elena Garrison, 2005-2007. His mother hadn't just cleaned houses for the Whitmores, she'd been Charles's bookkeeper, helping him hide millions in offshore accounts. She'd known about the fraud, documented it, even helped facilitate it. And when she'd tried to quit, when her conscience finally caught up with her greed, Charles had threatened to have her deported. Elena Garrison wasn't an illegal immigrant, but Charles had convinced her she was. He'd shown her forged documents, threatened to call ICE, promised to destroy Fletcher's future if she ever spoke about what she'd seen. The stress of keeping Charles's secrets, combined with the fear of losing her son, had literally killed her. Fletcher's mother hadn't died from overwork, she'd died from terror. When Fletcher confronted Charles with the evidence, he expected anger, maybe even violence. What he got was worse: disappointment. "You don't understand the complexity of business, son," Charles said, his voice calm and condescending. "Your mother was compensated well for her discretion. Everything I did to build something bigger than myself, something I could pass down to you." "You killed her," Fletcher whispered. "I gave her a purpose," Charles replied. "And I gave you a family. Don't throw that away over paperwork you don't understand." But Fletcher did understand. He understood that his entire life had been built on his mother's blood money. He understood that the Whitmores had never seen him as family, just as a convenient way to keep Elena quiet and compliant. That night, Fletcher took the files to the FBI. The response was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours, Fletcher found himself expelled from school for academic dishonesty, charges that Charles had somehow manufactured. His Harvard acceptance was revoked. His bank accounts, which Charles had helped him open, were frozen pending investigation into suspicious transactions. But the cruelest blow came from Isabella herself. "How could you betray us like this?" she sobbed, standing in the foyer where Fletcher's mother had died. "We loved you. We gave you everything, and you repay us by trying to destroy our family with lies." "They're not lies," Fletcher said, but she'd already turned her back on him. Within a week, Fletcher was homeless. The FBI investigation mysteriously stalled. Key evidence went missing. Witnesses recanted their statements, and Charles's lawyer produced documents that painted Elena as a mentally unstable woman prone to paranoid fantasies. The case was quietly closed. Fletcher spent the next 15 years in exile. He worked construction jobs, waited tables, delivered pizzas, anything to survive. The Hartford elite whispered his name like a curse. Crazy Fletcher, they called him, the boy who tried to bite the hand that fed him. He tried to rebuild his life, tried to move on, but every newspaper article about Charles's latest charity donation, every society page photo of Isabella's engagement, every reminder of the family that had cast him out like garbage, it all festered inside him like an infected wound. Then came the wedding invitation. Fletcher found it in his mailbox on a Tuesday evening, his name written in elegant calligraphy, Mr. Fletcher Garrison and guest. At first he thought it was a mistake. Then he realized the truth. It was a final insult, a way for the Whitmores to show the world that they were so powerful, so untouchable, they could invite their greatest enemy to their daughter's wedding and know he wouldn't dare cause trouble. They were wrong. But what they didn't know was that Fletcher had spent 15 years learning everything about poisons, chemistry, and the perfect revenge. And now, finally, he had the chance to make them pay. Fletcher sat in his rental car outside Banton Manor, watching the last guests arrive. His hands were steady now, the trembling from earlier replaced by cold determination. In his jacket pocket, the vial felt warm against his chest. 15 years of planning reduced to 12 milliliters of colorless death. He'd tested the formula dozens of times. Ricin extracted from castor beans, refined and concentrated until it was virtually undetectable, tasteless, odorless, and with a delayed onset that would give him the perfect alibi. By the time the first symptoms appeared, Fletcher would be long gone. The irony wasn't lost on him. Charles Whitmore had made his fortune in real estate, but his brother owned a pharmaceutical company. The very tools Fletcher would use for revenge had been developed in family laboratories. 7:23 p.m. Arrival. Fletcher walked through the manor's main entrance like he owned the place. His burgundy suit was perfectly tailored, his smile practiced and natural. The greeter, a young woman with a clipboard, barely glanced at him. "Good evening. Name?" "Fletcher Garrison," he said, his voice steady. She found his name on the list, made a small check mark and handed him a seating card. Table 12, far from the head table where the Whitmore family would sit, but close enough to watch their faces when the poison took hold. The ballroom was already half full. Fletcher recognized faces from his youth, family friends, business associates, society fixtures who'd once treated him like a beloved nephew. Now they looked through him like he didn't exist. Perfect. 8:15 p.m. Reconnaissance. During cocktail hour, Fletcher mapped the room with military precision. He noted the catering stations, the service entrances, the locations of security cameras. The waitstaff moved in predictable patterns, champagne service every 20 minutes, appetizers circulating clockwise around the room. Most importantly, he identified his targets. Theodore Whitmore held court near the bar, regaling younger relatives with stories of his glory days. Aunt Constance sat with Margaret's sister Patricia, their heads close together in gossip. Margaret herself floated between groups, every inch the perfect hostess. Each face on Fletcher's mental list was here. Each person who'd played a role in destroying his life was within reach. But Fletcher wasn't random in his selection. He'd spent months studying his targets' habits, their preferences, their routines. Theodore always drank champagne during toasts. Constance preferred white wine, but would switch to champagne for special occasions. Patricia had a weakness for expensive alcohol that she couldn't afford on her teacher's salary. He knew exactly who would drink what, and when. 9:41 p.m. The wedding party entrance. The band struck up "Canon in D" as the wedding party entered. Fletcher applauded along with everyone else, his eyes fixed on Isabella as she glided down the aisle in her grandmother's pearls and her mother's dress. She looked radiant, happy, completely unaware that her wedding day was about to become a massacre. For just a moment, Fletcher felt a flicker of the old affection. This was the girl he'd taught to ride a bike, who'd cried in his arms when her goldfish died, who'd once said she wanted to marry him when they grew up. Then he saw Charles, beaming with pride as he walked his daughter down the aisle. The same man who'd threatened to destroy Elena Garrison if she ever spoke the truth, the same man who'd built his empire on fraud and intimidation. The moment of doubt passed. 10:32 p.m. First contact. Fletcher excused himself from his table and walked toward the restroom, taking a route that led past the main catering station. The servers were busy plating the salad course, their attention focused on presentation and timing. He palmed the vial as he approached, unscrewing the cap with his thumb. The poison inside had no smell, no color, no taste. It would dissolve completely in alcohol, leaving no trace for forensic analysis to find. A server hurried past with a tray of dirty dishes. Another struggled with a heavy case of wine. Fletcher slipped behind the station, his movements casual and unhurried. The champagne glasses for the upcoming toast sat in perfect rows. Waterford Crystal filled with Dom Perignon 2008. Each glass represented a month of Fletcher's salary, back when he'd had a salary worth measuring. He selected the first glass, Theodore's, based on its position on the serving tray. 3 drops of poison, stirred gently with his finger. The liquid swirled for a moment, then settled back to golden perfection. Constance's glass. 3 more drops. Patricia's. 3 drops. One by one, Fletcher worked his way through his list. Margaret's cousin Robert, who'd spread lies about Fletcher's mental state. Charles's business partner Vincent, who'd helped fabricate the evidence against Elena. Margaret's bridge partner Dorothy, who'd turned the country club ladies against Fletcher's mother. 12 glasses total, 12 carefully selected targets, 12 doses of justice served at room temperature. 10:45 p.m. The toast. Fletcher returned to his seat as Charles Whitmore stood to address the crowd. The room fell silent, all eyes on the patriarch as he raised his glass. "Friends, family, honored guests," Charles began, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the union of Isabella and Preston, but the continuation of family, tradition, and love." The servers began distributing the champagne, moving efficiently between tables. Fletcher watched the poisoned glasses make their way to his targets, his heart hammering against his ribs. "To my daughter," Charles continued, "who has brought nothing but joy to our lives, to Preston, who we welcome into our family with open arms, and to all of you, who have made this night magical." Fletcher raised his own glass, unpoisoned, since he'd been careful to avoid the contaminated tray. Around the room, 200 guests did the same. "To Isabella and Preston," the crowd echoed the toast. Crystal chimed against crystal, and 12 people swallowed their own deaths without knowing it. Fletcher checked his watch. 10:47 p.m. In 20 to 30 minutes, the ricin would begin shutting down their cellular functions. There would be no antidote, no miracle cure, no last-minute salvation. Justice, Fletcher thought, had never tasted so sweet. 11:02 p.m. The dance Isabella and Preston took the floor for their first dance as husband and wife. The band played At Last as the couple swayed together, lost in their own private world. Around them, guests continued celebrating, unaware that death was already coursing through some of their bloodstreams. Fletcher excused himself again, walking toward the exit. He'd planned to leave before the symptoms began, establishing an alibi by checking into a hotel 30 miles away. Let the police question him. He'd be genuinely shocked by the tragedy, just another guest who'd left early to beat traffic. But as he reached the ballroom's ornate doors, something made him stop. Maybe it was morbid curiosity. Maybe it was the need to witness his revenge firsthand. Or maybe after 15 years of planning, Fletcher simply couldn't walk away from the culmination of his life's work. He turned back toward his table. 11:18 p.m. First symptoms. Uncle Theodore was the first to show signs. He'd consumed more champagne than the others, his glass emptied in 3 enthusiastic gulps during the toast. Now he was leaning heavily against the bar, one hand pressed to his stomach. "Too much rich food," his wife laughed, rubbing his back. "You know how you get at parties." But Fletcher could see the truth. Theodore's face was pale, sheened with sweat, despite the ballroom's perfect climate control. His breathing was becoming labored, each inhale a visible effort. The ricin was beginning its work. 11:23 p.m. The collapse. Theodore went down like a felled tree. One moment he was complaining about indigestion, the next he was convulsing on the marble floor, his body racked with violent spasms. Foam poured from his mouth, pink with blood from where he'd bitten his tongue. The music stopped. Screams echoed across the ballroom. Margaret dropped to her knees beside her brother-in-law, her white evening gown staining crimson as she tried to help him breathe. "Call 911!" Charles shouted, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Guests backed away in horror, creating a circle around Theodore's writhing form. That's when Aunt Constance started screaming. 11:26 p.m. The dominoes fall. Constance clutched her throat, blood streaming from her eyes like crimson tears. The ricin was attacking her cardiovascular system, rupturing blood vessels throughout her body. She stumbled toward the head table, reaching desperately for help, before collapsing next to the wedding cake. Then Patricia went down, then Robert, then Vincent. One by one, Fletcher's targets began dying exactly as he'd planned. But something was wrong. The symptoms were more severe than his tests had predicted, more violent than ricin typically caused. Had he miscalculated the dosage? Had the refined formula concentrated the toxin beyond his expectations? 11:31 p.m. Chaos. The ballroom erupted in panic. Guests screamed and ran for exits while others dropped to help the dying. Cell phones flickered like stars as people called 911, called family, called anyone who might make sense of the nightmare unfolding before them. Isabella stood frozen in the center of the dance floor, her wedding dress splattered with blood and vomit, watching her family die around her. Preston wrapped his arms around her, both of them too shocked to move. Charles Whitmore knelt beside his sister-in-law, Patricia, performing CPR with desperate efficiency. But Fletcher could see the truth in his eyes. Charles knew this wasn't food poisoning or a heart attack. This was deliberate. This was murder. And Charles's gaze was already scanning the crowd, looking for the person responsible. 11:35 p.m. Recognition. Their eyes met across the chaos. Fletcher standing calmly near the exit, Charles kneeling in a pool of his family's blood. For a moment, time stopped. Recognition dawned in Charles's face, followed immediately by rage. "You," Charles whispered, but his voice carried across the sudden silence as more guests collapsed. "Fletcher Garrison," Fletcher smiled. After 15 years, Charles finally understood who he was dealing with, but the moment of triumph turned to horror as Fletcher realized the scope of his miscalculation. 12 victims had become a bloodbath. The poison was spreading beyond his intended targets. 11:39 p.m. Unintended consequences. Margaret's sister had shared her champagne with her teenage daughter. Patricia had given a sip to her nephew, a college kid home for the summer. Vincent's wife had raised his glass to her lips when he wasn't looking, tasting the expensive champagne with curiosity. Cross-contamination, shared drinks, social habits Fletcher hadn't accounted for. His carefully targeted revenge was becoming indiscriminate slaughter. A 17-year-old girl collapsed near the dessert table, her prom dress. She'd worn it tonight because it made her feel grown up, now soaked with blood. An elderly waiter who'd sampled the champagne while serving began convulsing behind the catering station. Fletcher had wanted justice. Instead, he'd created a massacre. 11:42 p.m. The arrest. Fletcher didn't run. He stood perfectly still as chaos swirled around him, watching the consequences of his obsession unfold in real time. When the first police officers burst through the ballroom doors, alerted by dozens of panicked 911 calls, Fletcher raised his hands in surrender. "It was me," he said calmly. "I poisoned the champagne." If you're gripped by this story so far, hit that like button and drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think pushed Fletcher over the edge? Don't forget to subscribe and share this with others who love true crime. Officer Flora Thomas, the first responder who would later testify at Fletcher's trial, found him unnaturally calm for someone who'd just committed mass murder. While paramedics worked frantically to save lives around him, Fletcher sat quietly in the corner, his hands cuffed behind his back, staring at nothing. "Why?" Thomas asked him. "Why did you do this?" Fletcher's answer would haunt her for years. "Because they forgot I existed, and now they'll never forget again." 11:58 p.m. The final count. By midnight, 12 people lay dead or dying on the Banton Manor's marble floor. The bride's white dress was stained crimson. The groom held his new wife as she sobbed over her uncle's body, and the man who'd once been like family sat in the back of a police cruiser, finally satisfied that the Whitmore family would remember his name. But Fletcher's revenge had cost more than he'd ever intended to pay. Among the dead were 2 teenagers, an elderly server and Margaret's pregnant daughter-in-law, a young woman Fletcher had never even met. His quest for justice had become something far darker, something unforgivable. The perfect crime had become the perfect tragedy. Detective Stan Alfonso had seen his share of crime scenes, but nothing had prepared him for the Banton Manor. When he arrived at 12:23 a.m., the ballroom looked like a war zone. Blood pooled beneath overturned tables. Abandoned champagne glasses sat like evidence markers throughout the room. The smell of death and fear hung heavy in the air. "Jesus Christ," his partner, Detective Amanda Knox, whispered, stepping carefully around the chalk outlines. "What kind of monster does this to a wedding?" Alfonso had the same question. In 23 years on the force, he'd investigated gang shootings, domestic murders, even a serial killer who'd terrorized Hartford County in the 90s. But this was different. This was personal in a way that made his skin crawl. The first responders had done their best to save lives, but ricin poisoning leaves little room for miracles. By the time Alfonso arrived, 8 people were confirmed dead. 4 more clung to life in Hartford General's ICU, their chances declining by the hour. The killer, Fletcher Garrison, had confessed immediately and was already in custody. Open and shut case, right? Alfonso knew better. Nothing about mass murder was ever simple. The confession. Fletcher sat in interview room B like he was waiting for a job interview, his burgundy suit wrinkled but still presentable. He'd waived his right to an attorney, claiming he wanted to set the record straight. His confession was detailed, methodical, and completely unrepentant. "I planned this for months," Fletcher said, his voice steady as he walked Alfonso through the timeline. "I studied ricin extraction techniques. I calculated dosages based on body weight and alcohol consumption. I observed my target's drinking patterns during previous social events." Alfonso leaned forward. "Your targets?" "The people who destroyed my life," Fletcher replied matter-of-factly. "Theodore Whitmore called me a liar in front of the entire Hartford Country Club. Constance spread rumors that I was mentally unstable. Patricia convinced her friends to shun my mother before she died. So you decided to kill them." "I decided to give them what they gave me." Fletcher's pale eyes never wavered. "They poisoned my reputation, my relationships, my future. I simply returned the favor more literally." Alfonso had interrogated hundreds of killers, from crime of passion murderers to stone-cold psychopaths. Fletcher didn't fit any of the usual categories. He wasn't insane, wasn't driven by voices or delusions. He was methodical, rational, and completely convinced that his actions were justified. That made him more dangerous than any madman. The evidence. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Forensic analysts found traces of ricin in 12 champagne glasses, each one corresponding to Fletcher's target list. Security cameras captured him slipping behind the catering station at 10:32 p.m. His fingerprints were on the service area, and chemical residue on his clothing matched the poison samples. But Alfonso kept digging. Something about Fletcher's story felt incomplete. The breakthrough came when Alfonso's team searched Fletcher's apartment, a modest one-bedroom in Hartford's East Side. Hidden behind a false wall in the bedroom closet, they found Fletcher's revenge shrine. Photos of the Whitmore family covered every inch of the walls. Newspaper clippings documented their social events, their business deals, their charity work. A detailed timeline stretched across one wall, tracking 15 years of Fletcher's surveillance and planning. But the most disturbing discovery was Fletcher's journal. 300 pages of handwritten obsession that read like a madman's manifesto. May 15, 2018. Saw Isabella at the grocery store today. She looked right through me like I didn't exist, just like her father taught her. They think they can erase me from history, but I remember everything. Every kindness that turned to betrayal. Every promise that became a lie. August 3, 2018. Charles donated another $1 million to the Children's Hospital today. How generous of him to give away money he stole from people like my mother. The newspapers call him a philanthropist. I call him a killer in an expensive suit. November 12, 2018. First successful ricin extraction today. The castor beans worked perfectly. Mother would be proud. I'm finally using the chemistry knowledge she helped me earn. Too bad she's not here to see me balance the scales. Alfonso read every page, watching Fletcher's grief transform into rage, then into something far more dangerous. Cold, calculating hatred that had crystallized into perfect revenge. The victims. While Fletcher's journal revealed the twisted logic behind his actions, Alfonso focused on the victims. Each death told a story of lives cut short by one man's obsession with the past. Theodore Whitmore, 73, grandfather of 6 and beloved family patriarch. He'd called Fletcher a liar 15 years ago, but had he really deserved to die choking on his own blood? Constance Whitmore Hayes, 68, retired teacher who devoted 40 years to educating Hartford's children. Her crime? Gossiping about Fletcher's mental state after his breakdown. Patricia Kellerman, 61, single mother who'd worked 3 jobs to put her daughter through medical school. She'd spread rumors about Fletcher, yes, but she'd also been terrified of losing her position at the country club, her only source of social connection after her husband's death. One by one, Alfonso interviewed the survivors, building a picture of lives torn apart by violence. But the most heartbreaking testimony came from Isabella herself. "Fletcher was like a brother to me," she sobbed, still in her blood-stained wedding dress 12 hours after the attack. "When we were kids, he taught me to ride a bike. He scared away the bullies at school. He was family." "What changed?" Alfonso asked gently. "I don't know." Isabella's voice broke. "One day he was accusing my father of terrible things, showing us documents that made no sense. My parents said he was having a breakdown, that grief over his mother's death had made him paranoid and unstable. We tried to help him, but he just got angrier and angrier." Alfonso studied the young woman's face, looking for deception. He found only genuine confusion and grief. "Did you invite him to the wedding?" Isabella shook her head. "Nobody did. We haven't spoken to Fletcher in 15 years. When I saw his name on the guest list, I thought it was a mistake. Mom said maybe it was a peace offering, a way to show him we didn't hold grudges." A peace offering that had become a death sentence. The missing pieces. As Alfonso assembled the case file, inconsistencies began emerging. Fletcher's journal documented years of surveillance, but some of his information was impossibly detailed. He knew private conversations, family secrets, business decisions that should have been confidential. How had a man with no connections, no money, and no access penetrated the Whitmore family's inner circle so completely? The answer came from an unexpected source, Margaret Whitmore's housekeeper, Eleanor Vasquez. "Mr. Fletcher, he came to see me sometimes," Eleanor admitted reluctantly. "He would ask about the family, about their routines. I thought he was just lonely, you know, missing the old days when he lived with them." "What did you tell him?" Elena's face crumpled with guilt. "Everything. Their schedules, their habits, who was coming to dinner, what they talked about. I felt sorry for him. He seemed so sad, so lost. I never thought—" Alfonso realized the truth. Fletcher hadn't been working alone. Dozens of service workers, housekeepers, gardeners, caterers, valets, had unknowingly fed him information over the years. People who remembered the polite young man who'd once been part of the Whitmore family, people who felt sorry for his obvious loneliness. Fletcher had turned their kindness into weapons, their sympathy into surveillance. The unraveling. The final piece of the puzzle came from the FBI files Alfonso requested. Charles Whitmore had indeed been investigated for financial crimes 15 years ago, just as Fletcher claimed. The case had been closed when key evidence disappeared and witnesses recanted their testimony. But Alfonso found something Fletcher had missed: a sealed federal indictment that was never filed. The investigation had been dropped not because Charles was innocent, but because the government had made a deal. Charles would cooperate with a larger investigation into organized crime money laundering, providing information that led to dozens of arrests and convictions. Charles Whitmore was a criminal, yes, but he was also a federal informant whose cooperation had dismantled entire criminal enterprises. Elena Garrison hadn't died from the stress of keeping Charles's secrets. She'd died because she'd tried to expose an active federal investigation. Her son's crusade for justice had been built on a foundation of half-truths and misunderstood documents. Fletcher had spent 15 years planning revenge against people who were already paying for their crimes in ways he'd never understand. But by the time Alfonso discovered the truth, 12 people were dead, and Fletcher was beyond caring about the complexities of federal investigations or plea bargains. His revenge was complete, regardless of its justification. The aftermath of the Banton Manor massacre rippled outward like blood spreading across marble, staining everything it touched. Hartford General Hospital became a house of mourning. 4 additional victims died in the ICU over the following week, their organs shutting down as the ricin completed its deadly work. Patricia Kellerman lasted 6 days, long enough for her daughter, a resident at Johns Hopkins, to fly home and hold her mother's hand as she slipped away. Vincent Carbone's wife never regained consciousness, dying on a Tuesday morning while her husband sat helplessly beside her bed. By the end of July 2019, the final death toll stood at 12, exactly the number Fletcher had intended, though not always the people he'd planned to kill. Isabella Hayes, she'd kept her married name despite the circumstances, couldn't bring herself to return to the manor where her wedding had become a crime scene. The reception hall was closed indefinitely, the bloodstains on the marble floor proving impossible to completely remove. Local ghost hunters claimed the building was haunted, though the real ghosts were the living, survivors who jumped at sudden sounds, who couldn't drink champagne without seeing pink foam and blood. The Hayes marriage barely survived its first year. Preston developed severe PTSD, waking most nights screaming about poison and death. Isabella retreated into work, throwing herself into her legal career with an obsession that worried her friends. They attended counseling together, separately, in groups with other trauma survivors. Nothing seemed to bridge the gap between who they'd been on their wedding day and who they'd become after. They divorced quietly in November 2020. Margaret Whitmore aged 20 years in 20 days. She'd lost her brother-in-law, her sister, her closest friends, an entire generation of her social circle wiped out by a man she'd once considered a second son. She stopped attending charity events, stopped hosting dinner parties, stopped engaging with the world that had once revolved around her presence. Charles threw himself into work, expanding his real estate empire with ruthless efficiency. But those who knew him well noticed the changes: how he checked his food before eating, how he had every drink tested, how he hired private security for even casual social events. Paranoia became his constant companion. The Hartford Country Club, where many of the victims had been members, installed metal detectors and hired security guards. Other venues followed suit. Wedding receptions became exercises in security theater, guest lists scrutinized, bags searched, catering staff subjected to background checks. Fletcher's revenge had terrorized an entire community. The funeral procession stretched for blocks. Theodore's service at St. Paul's Cathedral drew over 800 mourners, including the governor and 2 senators. Constance was buried beside her husband in Hartford's prestigious Cedar Hill Cemetery, her grave marked with a simple stone that read, "Beloved teacher taken too soon." But the most heartbreaking service was for 17-year-old Anthonia Thomas, Patricia's niece who died after sharing her aunt's champagne. Anthonia had been valedictorian-bound, accepted to Yale with a full scholarship, planning to study medicine like her cousin. Her parents buried her in the blue dress she'd planned to wear to prom. The families filed wrongful death lawsuits against everyone they could think of: Banton Manor for inadequate security, the catering company for failing to protect their products, even the Whitmore family for somehow inspiring Fletcher's rage. Most were settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, the lawyers understanding that no amount of money could truly compensate for lives lost. Media attention was relentless. The story had everything tabloid editors loved: wealth, betrayal, family secrets, and shocking violence at what should have been a joyful celebration. True crime podcasters dissected every detail of Fletcher's planning. Netflix announced a limited series about the case, social media filled with amateur detectives debating whether Fletcher was a monster or a victim of circumstance. The attention horrified the survivors almost as much as the original crime. Isabella changed her phone number 6 times to escape reporters. Margaret hired a public relations firm to handle media requests, which came from as far away as Japan and Germany. Charles refused all interviews, communicating only through lawyers who promised swift legal action against anyone who misrepresented the family's story. The Whitmore family name, once synonymous with Hartford high society, became a cautionary tale about the price of keeping secrets. Local businesses suffered as tourists arrived seeking macabre souvenirs. The Banton Manor's ownership changed hands 3 times before finally being converted into office space, the ballroom sealed off and forgotten. Tour companies began offering Hartford horror packages, visiting sites associated with the case. Fletcher's old apartment became a shrine for true crime enthusiasts who left flowers, notes, and theories about his motivations. The landlord eventually had to hire security to keep trespassers away. But perhaps the most lasting impact was psychological. Hartford's elite began looking over their shoulders, wondering what secrets from their past might one day return as violence. Mental health services in the area saw a surge in patients dealing with survivors' guilt, paranoia, and anxiety about social events. The sense of safety that money and status had always provided was shattered irreparably. Schools implemented new programs about bullying and social exclusion after psychologists suggested Fletcher's ostracism had been a contributing factor. The FBI added the case to their training materials as an example of how long-term surveillance could enable catastrophic violence. Wedding planners across New England reported booking declines as couples opted for smaller, more intimate ceremonies. The phrase "pulling a Fletcher" entered local slang, meaning to nurse a grudge far past the point of reason. Even today, more than 4 years later, the impact continues. Support groups for the survivors meet monthly at Hartford Hospital. A scholarship fund in Antonia Thomas's name provides college assistance to promising students. The Whitmore family quietly funds research into ricin detection and antidotes. Isabella Hayes works as a victims' rights advocate, helping families navigate the legal system after violent crimes. She never remarried, never had the children she'd once dreamed of having. In interviews, the few she grants, she speaks carefully about the importance of mental health services and the dangers of unaddressed trauma. Charles Whitmore died of a heart attack in March 2023, 4 years after the massacre. Margaret found him in his study, slumped over financial reports he'd been reviewing. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but those who knew him believed Fletcher had claimed one final victim, that the stress and paranoia of living with constant threats had finally killed the man who'd survived the poisoning itself. Margaret moved to Florida after Charles's funeral, selling the family home and its memories to developers who turned it into luxury condominiums. She lives quietly now, her phone number unlisted, her social media accounts private. The house where Fletcher had once been treated like family is now home to strangers who have no idea of its dark history. Before we wrap up, make sure you subscribe and join our exclusive true crime community, where we share disturbing stories too raw for YouTube. And if you want to dive deeper, check out our books, The Killer's Mind, Psychology Behind Shocking Murders, and Too Disturbing for YouTube. 7 Shocking Murder Stories by Mike Darren Boyle, both for the price of a coffee. Links are in the description. Fletcher Garrison sits in his cell at the Connecticut State Correctional Institution, serving 12 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He's 56 now, his hair gone completely gray, his face marked by the kind of deep lines that come from carrying hatred for too long. He doesn't receive many visitors. Isabella came once in 2021, hoping to find closure or understanding, or maybe just answers to questions that had haunted her for years. They sat across from each other in the sterile visiting room, separated by reinforced glass, speaking through phones that made their voices sound tinny and distant. "Why?" she asked, the same question that had tormented her since that night in June. "We loved you. You were family." Fletcher studied her face, older now, marked by grief and trauma, but still recognizably the little girl he'd taught to ride a bicycle in the Whitmore driveway. "You threw me away when I became inconvenient," he said quietly. "You chose your parents' lies over my mother's truth. You were never my family. You were my biggest mistake." Isabella left without saying goodbye. She hasn't returned. Prison officials describe Fletcher as a model inmate. He works in the library, helps other prisoners prepare for their GED exams, and has never been involved in violence or disciplinary issues. He's polite to guards, helpful to fellow inmates, and shows no signs of the rage that once consumed his life. It's as if murdering 12 people had finally given him peace. Psychiatrists who've evaluated Fletcher struggle to diagnose him. He shows no signs of traditional mental illness, no delusions, no psychotic breaks, no chemical imbalances that might explain his actions. His crime was methodical, calculated, and entirely rational within his twisted worldview. Dr. Sarah Hendricks, who spent 6 months interviewing Fletcher for a federal study on domestic terrorism, concluded that he represents something more dangerous than madness. He represents what happens when grievance becomes identity. "Fletcher didn't just commit murder," she wrote in her report. "He committed existential revenge. His entire sense of self was built around the injustices done to him. When he finally acted on those grievances, he wasn't just killing his enemies, he was completing himself." The question that haunts everyone who studies the case is whether Fletcher's revenge was preventable. Could 15 years of festering resentment have been interrupted by intervention, therapy, or simply human connection? Margaret Whitmore believes it could have been. In her only public statement about the case, released through her attorney in 2022, she wrote, "We failed Fletcher when he needed us most. Yes, he was disturbed and angry, but he was also grieving and alone. Maybe if we'd shown him compassion instead of dismissal, if we'd tried to help instead of casting him out, those 12 people would still be alive." Charles had disagreed, believing Fletcher was fundamentally broken long before the FBI investigation. In private conversations with friends, Charles maintained that Fletcher's violence was inevitable, that some people carry darkness inside them that no amount of kindness can cure. We'll never know which perspective is correct. What we do know is that the Banton Manor massacre represents a perfect storm of factors: family secrets, social ostracism, mental health neglect, and a justice system that failed to protect both Fletcher's mother and his eventual victims. The case has become required study in criminology programs across the country, not because it reveals new truths about human nature, but because it illustrates old truths we'd prefer to ignore. That revenge is a poison we drink, hoping others will suffer. That exclusion and rejection can transform love into hate. That sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone has forgotten is there. Fletcher's crime reminds us that our actions have consequences that ripple outward in ways we can't predict or control. The Whitmore family's decision to protect their secrets by destroying Fletcher didn't just ruin one young man's life. It ultimately cost 12 people their lives and traumatized an entire community. In the end, Fletcher got exactly what he wanted. The Whitmore family will never forget his name. But the price of that remembrance was higher than anyone, including Fletcher himself, had ever imagined. The last words belong to Antonia Thomas's mother, spoken at her daughter's funeral. "Hatred is not something you feel, it's something you choose. And every day you choose it, it grows stronger, until it consumes not just you, but everyone around you. My daughter died because someone chose hatred over healing, revenge over redemption. Don't let her death be meaningless. Choose love instead. It's a lesson the survivors carry with them every day, and one the rest of us would do well to remember. The champagne glasses at the Banton Manor will never sparkle quite the same way again, but maybe that's exactly as it should be.